Hi, we did our presentation on caffeine and cognition, looking into how in older adults without cognitive impairment, how their cognitive decline might be affected by caffeine intake from coffee or tea versus no caffeine intake at all. Dave is going to start us out. I hope you enjoy our presentation.
Caffeine is a global commodity that has long been associated with the enhancement of mood and information processing. While many products like ice cream, chocolate, and soft drinks contain varying amounts of caffeine, caffeine is widely consumed for its stimulant-like effects. The perceived benefits of caffeine are often in the forms of short-term increases in cognitive performance and mood. While consumption of caffeine is associated with increases in cognitive performance and mood, the effects of caffeine on human disease and pathologies have been examined considerably. By 2050, it is estimated that 130 million people will be tormented by a chronic illness called dementia. Dementia, a progressive neurodegenerative disease, works slowly over time to first dismantle one's short-term memory, speech, and then progresses to a complete loss of voluntary physical abilities like swallowing and spontaneous breathing. With dementia becoming a public health issue, new research has been conducted to combat the chronic illness. While there are several current and new medications available for persons with dementia, treating dementia must begin before the disease manifests. Dementia prophylaxis is becoming an exciting avenue for research. While the short-term effects of caffeine on cognition have garnered a significant amount of research, new studies are beginning to examine the long-term effects of caffeine consumption. Ultimately, the studies are examining whether caffeine consumption provides a protection from cognitive diseases like dementia. Specifically, this analysis paper will examine how the consumption of caffeinated beverages influences cognition in older adults. Ultimately, through the examination of meta-analysis of observational studies and systematic reviews, one can evaluate the consistency of findings to determine whether caffeine consumption influences cognitive decline over time.
So what databases were used and searched? So for our group, the search strategy involved using the databases supplied by Capital University, which included Google Scholar, PubMed, Medline, and ProQuest. Then the researchers used a large collection of databases on the Blackmore online library. Some were the relevant search terms used. So when utilizing these databases, the terms searched for were caffeine, coffee, and caffeine consumption. When searching for terms related to cognition, the terms searched were dementia, Alzheimer's, and cognition. Cognition was further broken down into cognitive function, performance, and impairment. Once these articles were collected, the researchers then combined the terms. For instance, articles or journals utilizing the terms caffeine and dementia in the title were subsequently collected. And then further selections of the type of articles were conducted by reading the titles and abstracts. And that's essentially how the articles were selected. And once those titles and abstracts that incorporate the specific search criteria that we just identified, we then deemed them compatible by the committee. Other criteria involved in finding the articles we were looking for articles that utilized a randomized control trial, meta-analyses of observational studies, or systematic reviews. So what are the inclusion criteria? The inclusion criteria utilized for the study involved finding articles that directly related to either dementia or caffeine. In terms of specific criteria, articles that found meta-analyses of randomized control trials, meta-analyses of observational studies, or systematic reviews. Exclusion criteria involved removing articles that involved a non-randomized control trial, case studies, or observational reviews. They are strictly observational reviews. Articles that were evaluating a number of exposures, multiple exposures from caffeine, except coffee and tea were excluded, so like that'd be chocolate or other things that we have in our daily life that contain caffeine. because we had the inability to be able to prove that caffeine had a single effect on cognition. Articles that involved a discussion around ice cream, candy bars, and soda drinks were excluded as well. And part of the selection process, again, I'll just go over this, the articles, and the number of articles appraised were 4, and the ones that we chose were the caffeine intake from coffee or tea and cognitive disorders and meta-analysis of observational studies. We selected coffee consumption and risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, a dose-response meta-analysis. Our next was coffee, caffeine, and health outcomes, and umbrella review. And our final selected article was caffeine intake, dementia, systematic review, and meta-analysis. So the synopsis of articles appraised, including measurements, samples, and results, and what are the strengths and limitations of each article. So for the first article, caffeine intake from coffee or tea and cognitive disorders, a meta-analysis of observational studies. So essentially, giving you a brief overview of this study, was the researchers used observational epidemiological studies such as cross-sectional case control and cohort studies, and they looked at how they have reported inconsistent findings regarding the association between caffeine intake, coffee and tea, and the risk of cognitive disorders, such as dementia and Alzheimer's disease, cognitive impairment, cognitive decline. And what they essentially did was try to combine all of these studies. And some of the methods that they used to find these studies in the first place were PubMed and Embase. 3 evaluators independently extracted and reviewed articles based on their predetermined selection criteria. Out of their results, out of 293 articles identified, 20 were epidemiological studies, which involved over 31,479 participants. And the pooled odds ratios, or relative risk of the caffeine intake from coffee or tea, was 0.82 with a 95% confidence interval. So some of the strengths and sample characteristics was the article's ability to assess for methodological quality. So essentially what they did was, with each article that they appraised, they assigned, based on a set of criteria, they awarded articles so many stars, with 8 being perfect. And overall, out of all the studies that they examined, the average star that was awarded was 6.8. So the precision or the methodological quality of each article was high. Also, in terms of the sample characteristics, with 31,479 participants, it is really good. Having a large sample size will help make the results more precise as well. And the inclusion of multiple studies could be seen as a strength as well. The researchers went out of their way to find different types of models, different types of evidence to help support their claims. So some of the limitations with this article was that they only considered coffee and tea as a source of caffeine intake. Therefore, there was a limitation regarding the generalization of the findings regarding the effect of caffeine intake on the risk of cognitive disorders such as AD and dementia. Second, it was really hard to evaluate the exact amounts of caffeine intake for each study because multiple people drink or the amount of caffeine contained in a cup of coffee ranges, and the way coffee is prepared is different as well. So the results for this meta-analysis found that caffeine intake from coffee or tea was not associated with the risk of cognitive disorders. And this is an important distinction because, especially for our PICO question, is because essentially one is unlikely to develop a cognitive disease from caffeine. Thus, we know that we must be able to rule out that dementia and Alzheimer's disease are not being caused by caffeine. And that's an important distinction to make moving forward, especially if we want to look at whether or not caffeine is actually reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So, moving on to the next article, this is Coffee Consumption and Risk of Dementia and Alzheimer's Disease, a dose-response meta-analysis of prospective studies. So essentially, the researchers performed a dose-response meta-analysis to summarize the prospective data on coffee consumption and associated risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And some of the methods that they used to identify these articles were by searching databases such as PubMed, and they did this all the way back from January 1966, and Web of Science from 1945 all the way up to October 4th, 2018. And they also scrutinized the reference list of the pertinent publications. In order to do this, two researchers independently reviewed the literature, and the results were combined using a restricted cubic spline random effects dose-response meta-analysis based on a one-stage approach. And 8 relevant prospective studies were identified to have this search. In terms of the sample size, these studies included 7,486 dementia cases diagnosed among 328,000 individuals during an average follow-up of 4.9 to 25 years. And a meta-analysis of all 8 studies indicated no statistically significant association between coffee consumption and the risk of dementia. And the relative risk of dementia per 1 cup per day increment of coffee consumption was 1.09 with a 95% confidence interval, and the p equaling 0.37. The meta-analysis of 5 studies that focus on Alzheimer's disease also revealed no association between coffee consumption and Alzheimer's disease, and no deviations of a linear trend with a p of 0.79. So essentially, these results found do not support an association between coffee consumption and increased risk of overall dementia or Alzheimer's disease specifically. But really interestingly, one of the studies that this article analyzed was one that found that showed daily versus no daily coffee consumption was associated with a reduction of 31% in the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is important because while this is similar to the previous article above, this one started to begin finding that there might be some association with a reduction of cognitive disorders like those of Alzheimer's disease. Now, in terms of the strengths of this article, a strength of this meta-analysis was based on the fact that it utilized articles starting back from the early 1945s all the way up to 2018. And it made sure to utilize inclusion and exclusion criteria as well. And when reviewing those 8 prospective studies, the utilization and adjusting for confounding variables such as age, sex, gender, and ethnicity were key components of these research articles. Now, some of the limitations obviously goes back to only 8 studies being identified. Just looking at that number from between 1945 until now, only having 8 studies on this topic is you would expect to see more. Another limitation of this meta-analysis was that some of the articles that the 8 prospective studies, some used self-reported coffee consumption, and based on our research, self-reported coffee consumption leads to measurement errors, which may have resulted in attenuated results. The exact amount and concentration of the coffee consumed are difficult to measure by a questionnaire, and therefore this particular meta-analysis may not have captured the true dose-response relationship between coffee consumption and dementia risk. Likewise, the diagnosis of dementia and AD also differed among the studies, and there might be some degree of misclassification of dementia. Thus, going based off that, it is interesting to note what I stated earlier, that some of the studies found that there was a reduction in Alzheimer's disease, which makes this research article very applicable to our PICO question. And now Dre is going to do the next 2 articles for you.
Thanks, John. In our 3rd article, Coffee, Caffeine, and Health Outcomes, an Umbrella Review, the authors were searching for an association between coffee consumption and various health outcomes such as cardiovascular disease, prostate cancer, and Alzheimer's disease. Similar to the previous articles, the researchers sought to find trial studies by searching PubMed and Embase for the terms coffee, caffeine, and meta-analysis. They included the following types of studies: meta-analysis of observational studies considering coffee consumption or caffeine intake as the exposure variable of interest, and any health outcome and meta-analyses of random control trials assessing the effects of coffee or caffeine administration from any source and for any clinical outcome. They excluded studies in which coffee consumption was part of the outcome, studies on genetic polymorphisms related to coffee consumption, studies that evaluated the prevalence of coffee consumption, and randomized control trials that combined coffee administration with other treatments. In order to evaluate the connection, they performed an umbrella review, that is, a review that aims to systematically examine existing research for the same intervention or phenomena of interest. Whenever more than one meta-analysis was found using the same outcome and the same study design and type of population, the articles were evaluated for the main outcome of interest. For further analyses, the most recent or most exhaustive study was considered. When more than one study design was evaluated, results were considered and reported in the following order of importance: meta-analyses of prospective studies, comprehensive prospective and case control studies, and case control studies. The pooled analyses of the highest versus the lowest category of exposure and dose-response analysis were evaluated. Direction, magnitude, and heterogeneity were considered when scoring the level of evidence. Based on this criteria, the evidence for decreased risk of Alzheimer's based on caffeine consumption was graded as highly possible. A sample size of 244 articles was selected based on the researchers' inclusion and exclusion parameters. Out of the 244 articles collected, 79 articles with 15,761 participants reported a reduced risk of Alzheimer's with a relative risk of 0.73 with a 95% confidence interval. The findings also indicated that caffeine consumption may provide some anti-inflammatory benefits and provide some inhibition to oxidative stress produced by free radicals. While the research article may provide some insight into whether an association exists between caffeine and cognition, the risks of excess caffeine consumption may outweigh the benefits. Going back to our PICO question, further research needs to be conducted to test whether oxidative stress and reduction of anti-inflammatory agents protects the elderly from cognitive disease. Consequently, if coffee consumption is to provide cognitive protection, do the benefits outweigh an increased risk for cardiovascular, colon, and prostate diseases? In our last article, Caffeine Intake and Dementia, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis, the researchers were evaluating claims from 4 2004 studies which found a negative association between Alzheimer's and caffeine consumption, despite important heterogeneity in the methods and results. Since several similar studies had been published since then with new insights, they felt the subject deserved another look. Thus, the researchers conducted a systemic review of research through 2010 by searching Medline, Scopus, and Web of Science. The studies were selected by 3 independent reviewers and contained 9 cohort and 2 case control studies. The researchers used random effects meta-analysis to obtain the most precise estimates of quantitative data synthesis. Ultimately, the 11 studies published between 1989 and 2009 met the final inclusion criteria for systematic review, with the main characteristics of the studies and results focusing on the relationship between caffeine intake and cognitive impairment. The researchers found a positive trend towards protective effects of caffeine with a relative risk of 0.84 with a 95% confidence interval. However, the limited number of epidemiological studies precludes definitive results. While this study may provide the best evidence for our PICO question, the articles selected and studied did not utilize an age group, specifically older adults. Further research may help alleviate the areas to which there is not enough epidemiological evidence. Results. The results of all of the articles we selected were similar, showing weak to no association between caffeine consumption and the risks of dementia. Additionally, after collecting and analyzing the data, the researchers all concluded the same significant issue, that there was a substantial number of confounding factors involved. The 4 articles explained the potential benefits coffee has due to its antioxidant agents. However, they failed to discover if caffeine was a neuroprotective agent. With such similar results, it is unsurprising that information for all 4 articles was obtained from the same types of sources: longitudinal studies such as cohorts, cross-sectional, and case control studies. Only Grosso et al. Also provided a small amount of evidence from randomized control trials, which Kim et al. Also concluded would be beneficial in future research on the subject. While each article measured something a little different, the articles were all comparable in the general goal of their research, the time frame being studied, and in their results. All 4 articles were based on the interest in the possible preventative effects of caffeine, specifically caffeine from coffee, on cognitive impairment in individuals with no current signs of cognitive decline. The researchers all used similar search terms to collect and provide data from observational studies over a similar extended period of time. They all presented their data in a similar fashion, using the heterogeneity model with confidence intervals, case control studies, cohort studies, and cross-sectional studies. They used graphs to present the data, which provided nice visuals showing there was little correlation among caffeine and risk for cognitive decline. The common confounding factor between all of the studies that proved difficult for everyone to work around was that chronic smokers tend to drink several cups of coffee in a day, adding tobacco and nicotine to the increase in daily caffeine. Overall, our results on caffeine consumption and risk for cognitive impairment, as well as those of each article, were inconclusive. The human brain is extremely complex, and genetic precursors to Alzheimer's and dementia are still being discovered or are unknown. And with several modifiable risk factors influencing individuals at different regularities, measuring the long-term effects of caffeine consumption becomes a daunting research endeavor. Ultimately, the researchers discovered there needs to be more epidemiological evidence in order to understand this phenomenon. For example, since coffee and tea were being used as the source of caffeine rather than caffeine on its own, there was no way to separate the results of the caffeine versus the considerable antioxidant agents in the beverages that have previously been linked to decreasing the risks for dementia. Additionally, since most of the studies used for all 4 of the articles were observational studies, the amount of caffeine and confounding factors were unable to be controlled.
What are the committee's recommendations for caffeine consumption? So essentially, we want to have caffeine be an implemented protocol within hospital systems, starting off in the greater Columbus area. But in order to get there, we believe that some sort of implementation plan or some sort of framework should be established first in order to gather a larger sample size. So, for instance, one of the ways we could do that is using the Iowa-based practice model, which would essentially help transition our research findings that we do in the field or that we presented in this presentation, and hopefully using those findings and utilizing them into clinical practice. And starting off in the greater Columbus area would be a great first step. And the Iowa-based model is a really good model because it essentially breaks down the clinical process down into 5 steps, which is assessing or developing a question, deciding and looking at what has worked in other places, and then collecting the data, seeing that if a change is really needed in the hospital system, implementing that change, and then evaluating that change to see whether it worked. So I guess that would be one of the strategies that we would use in order to determine whether or not if the caffeine consumption is really working. Going back to some of the strategies to strengthen this recommendation, I think it's important to look at what were the limitations of this research, because there were quite a few. First off, there are many sources of caffeine intake. For instance, this study only looked at coffee and tea, but I'm sure you know there are several hundreds, thousands, beyond my perception of foods that contain caffeine. Therefore, there's already a limitation regarding our generalization to the findings, whether or not what sources of caffeine are truly the ones that are preventing cognitive disorders. Second, it was hard to evaluate amounts of caffeine intake in each study. So, for instance, many people drink varying amounts of coffee. One person might drink 1 cup, and another might drink 5 in the morning or within a day. And because of that, that makes studying, if caffeine really has an influence on cognition, is there a set amount that needs to be established when moving forward? And we believe that's one of the things that they need to do. While, caffeine can range from between 70 to 220 milligrams, even the type of coffee bean and preparation methods are different. So moving forward, I think, or we believe that the recommendation should be to create some sort of standard where all the variables are controlled. So, for instance, controlling the amount of milligrams of caffeine intake for a day, or controlling what type of coffee bean and preparation method are used. And even within tea itself, tea is going to be typically, classified into 3 types according to the degrees of fermentation. Black tea, oolong tea, and green tea. One's fermented, one's not. And those can have effects on the long-term development of cognitive diseases. In terms of the study designs, we noticed, even though a lot of our studies that we utilized were meta-analyses or systematic reviews, a lot of the articles that they were reviewing were either testing, or were merely surveys or volunteers that joined a lot of these groups. And we believe that one of the recommendations that we could go or use moving forward is trying to utilize some sort of randomized controlled trial and pulling away from those surveys. And based on some of the information that I mentioned before, that I understand that it's a very difficult thing to do, especially when you already can't control the type of coffee bean, how much coffee. But regardless, we believe that if some sort of randomized control trial were to be implemented on a wide scale, say Columbus or Ohio, that this evidence could provide more insight into the clinical problem at hand. In terms of the sample characteristics, this made answering our PICO question quite difficult because age was not really considered, or age was not considered at all in almost all the studies that we looked at. And this is problematic because one of the things that our PICO question was looking at was how do we, in the long term, use caffeine consumption to prevent cognitive disorders in the elderly. And that question was difficult because, while we know that caffeine may produce this antioxidant effect and regulate amyloid precursors, amyloid B proteins, that wasn't really looked at in age-specific populations. So moving forward, when we're looking at sample characteristics, if we can somehow use age and control age, I believe that'll help researchers in the future determine whether or not age seems to have a factor in whether or not caffeine consumption is successful. In terms of interventions that could be done in the future, we believe that baselines need to be first established within a certain population. And some of the tools that they can do or use in order to determine that baseline is a clinical dimension scale, mini mental status exams, and MRI scans to really measure baseline cognitive function, which I believe would provide a good base to which researchers can then begin studies. And another intervention that can be done as well is drawing plasma caffeine levels. And this would provide a more reliable measure of caffeine versus self-report and surveys, which in the most part was the main self-report and surveys were the main component to many of the studies that we saw. So if the studies and the future studies were to utilize some sort of plasma caffeine level draws and to be able to use tools like the mini mental status exams and MRI scans, we believe that the level of evidence and the type of interventions used would be, the reliability and validity of them would be increased greatly. And hopefully once these strategies to strengthen this recommendation are implemented, the dissemination of results through the Iowa-based model will be finished. And hopefully this new research will look beyond the age limit that we established and continue to find novel ways to tackle dementia and Alzheimer's. Thank you.
And that concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Our email addresses are all listed here on this slide. Thank you so much. And our references are to follow.